Friday, or this past Friday, was the day that we celebrated Christmas. And Christmas is about the birth of Jesus. Now, you may or may not know this, but Christmas, or the birth of Jesus, is a pivotal point in the Bible. Now, you may or may not know this, but the Bible is basically divided into two large chunks. One is called the Old Testament. Does anybody know what the other one's called? New Testament. So you've got the Old Testament and the New Testament. And these two are like, they're pivoting on the birth of Jesus. Now that sounds crazy, but let me tell you why. See, the Old Testament has 39 books in it. So there's 39 books that make up the Old Testament. There are 27 books that make up the New Testament. Now, you would say, well, that doesn't balance out pretty even. It should be better. There's 66 books. It should be, whatever half of that is, 31 and a half and 31 and a half, or 33 and 33, whatever it is. But the way that it balances out is the first half, really the Old Testament describes the history of the people that God chose to bring his Messiah to or through, his anointed one. Messiah means anointed one. Say that with me. Messiah means anointed one. So God makes this promise, and history is recorded in this Old Testament of God's promises of fulfilling. It tells about the fall of humanity, about sin and how it came into the world. It describes everything from that point on, even before sin came into the world. It describes the creation of the world all the way up to the point of this promise of a Messiah, and how God was going to reconcile, or how God was going to take man's choice to sin, Adam's choice to sin, and how he was going to restore humanity back to perfection. And so it's a story of not only history of this group of people called the Jewish nation, but it's a story of how we all fit into that. It includes in the Old Testament some prophecies. Prophecies are no more than words or comments that God had basically spoken to someone, and they wrote them down about what's to come, something in the future. And so these prophecies, many of them focus around this Messiah coming, which we know that his name was Jesus. Now, Jesus, his name, when we translate that, means to save. So they're looking for a Messiah named Jesus. They didn't know his name. So the Old Testament are looking. We're looking for this anointed one, somebody coming to help us, somebody coming to deliver us, somebody coming to fix things that we've broken. That's what they're looking for. Now, the New Testament is the writings that talk about the fulfillment of this promise of a Messiah coming. So one is talking about there's something coming. God's made us a promise. It's coming. And the New Testament is talking about this is what's happening around that Messiah coming, and what's going to happen therefore after, how this restoration of the world comes. It's a group of letters in the New Testament a group of books in the New Testament which are letters that are written to churches talking about how to live out life underneath the rule of this Messiah, which we know to be Jesus. Now, the last book in the Old Testament, now chronologically, the books in the Old Testament are not put in alphabetical order, or in the New Testament, not in alphabetical order, and they're not in chronological order. There are actually times where the Bible will be talking about one particular time period here and skip several hundred years, and then the next book might pick up and go backwards some. Do you understand what I'm saying? It's almost like watching Star Wars. They put out episode 4, 5, and 6, and then they come back and put out 1, 2, and 3, and now they come back to 7, and you get so confused and you can't tell. So sometimes that's what it seems like. But just understand this. The last chronological book of the Bible was the book of Nehemiah. Now, that's the last chronological book of the Old Testament, was Nehemiah. Now, from the time of Nehemiah to the first book that is written in the Old Testament chronologically, because we know Matthew's, by the way it goes now, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John is the way it starts out the gospel. But the truth is, the first book was written by Jesus' brother named James. What was Jesus' brother's name? And he wrote the first book chronologically that got put in, that we now have in the Bible, James. Now, between the time, that was written around 40 or 44 BC or AD. Nehemiah was written around 400 AD. So there's this huge 400-year gap, 440-year gap between the Old Testament and the New Testament. There's no scriptures written to cover that area. There's a 400-year gap. This is the breaking point, or the pivotal point, of the Bible. All this conversation about how we got to where we were and a Messiah is coming. A 400-year gap, and now the Messiah is here, and how do we live? Does this make sense to you? This is how the Bible is broken up. Now, let's talk about the Christmas story. Now, the Christmas story, we know that Mary was pregnant in some miraculous way. Mary gave birth to a child based on the comment. Now remember, Jesus wasn't born yet, but the people that were writing that, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and the people who wrote about that, were writing about the few days or the few months right before Jesus' birth, so you could capture that. That's why it's included in the New Testament and not the Old. Okay? So they talk about Mary getting pregnant. They talk about Mary and Joseph together. They talk about them having a census. Remember, they were going back to Bethlehem, right? And there was a why? Does anybody remember why they went back to Bethlehem? Does anybody remember who ordered the census? Does anybody remember? Augustus, Caesar Augustus. Remember, there was a so see that name. Does that name Caesar Augustus sound familiar to you? It's not a name that we just know. Caesar Augustus called for a census for everybody to go back to their town and be counted. So remember his name because he's important. Okay? Now, I want to talk to you today. That's the Old Testament. I want to talk to you about how this fulfillment happened. And I want to talk to you about a particular person that in the Scriptures, not much is given to him in terms of understanding or who he is. But I'm going to let you know about this guy. His name is Herod the Great. Okay? Herod the Great. I think I actually got a picture up there. That's what he supposedly looks like. That's some carving that they found. Herod the Great. Now let me tell you about Herod. Okay? Herod ruled over the Jewish people in Israel at the time just before Jesus was born and the early years of Jesus' life. Okay? So he was right before Jesus was born. So Mary and Joseph would have been underneath his rule in Jerusalem, and right after that. Now, Herod the Great was not completely Jewish. The Romans had actually put him in charge. The Roman Empire had captured everything, and they put Herod over the Jewish territory. But he wasn't completely Jewish. He was born to a guy named Antipater. Okay? And he was from Idumea. And his mama was a daughter of an Arab sheik. Didn't know that. So he's really not Jewish. He's not even really born Jewish, but he's over the Jewish people. So the Jewish people don't really, that's one thing they don't like about him. Herod the Great was a great schemer. And he took advantage of the political unrest, and he clawed his way to the top. And let me explain how. In the Roman Empire, there was this civil war that happened. And it basically happened between Mark Antony and this guy named Octavian. Okay? Mark Antony, and who was the other guy? Octavian was his name. Now later on, Octavian, who was the guy that they talk about in Shakespeare that killed him? Brutus. Who was that they talking about? Caesar. Caesar was killed. Who was that? You remember what I'm talking about? They killed him or whatever, and Mark, They were four. Do you know? Does anybody know? Who's a history buff? I don't know. Okay, but understand. Read Shakespeare, you get it. So my point is, when all this happened, when that death of that Caesar, when that death happened, these two guys, Mark Antony and Octavian, began to have a civil war. Okay? Now, the end of that, Mark Antony was married to some woman, some queen in Egypt. Do you remember what her name was? Cleopatra. So Mark Antony was married. Now, you hear these names, Cleopatra, you hear all this stuff, and you think, well, it has nothing to do with the Bible. This is what's going on right before Jesus is born. So everybody was worried that when Mark Antony, if he got in charge, he would hook up. He's already connected with Cleopatra. Cleopatra's going to come over and take over the whole Roman Empire. That's why Mark Antony just got his butt whooped, and they sent him back to Egypt. But then this other guy, Octavius, he begins to be the ruler of all of Rome. Know what they changed his name to? Augustus Caesar, better known as Caesar Augustus. That is the Caesar at the time that Jesus was born. This Caesar ends up backing and supporting Herod the Great to be over the Jewish people. Now, once King Herod, or Herod began to be king, he launched an ambitious building program. The temple had been torn down from all what other countries had come in and destroyed it. So he went in and started rebuilding the temple. All of this before Jesus was born. And I'm talking about, a huge undertaking. Now, I've been to Israel, and I've seen, now, everything that was up to a certain height was destroyed. But when you go to Israel, the foundation that everything was built on, the huge foundation, the foundation's like 4 stories high. The foundation of the whole Temple Mount was 4 stories high. That is the picture that when you see on TV of the people praying at the Wailing Wall. You ever heard of that? They're not praying at the actual wall of Israel, of that temple. They're praying at the retaining wall. Now, within that retaining wall are some of the stones that they call Herod stones. Herod was so precise, and so he had stones that were carved out. And I'm telling you the truth because I stood beside them, that are about this high, from the ground this high. One side of it, so that's about 5 foot, 4 foot, 5 foot stone. Imagine that as a rectangle that goes from here to that building over there, one stone. Can you imagine how that was cut out to make that? He was a huge builder. And he built and remodeled and refixed up the temple. There was another city port there called Caesarea that he named after Caesar. He fixed up that port. He built aqueducts. He brought water in. I went to Caesarea, and they talked about how they had these pools. They wanted cold water. So when they bring the cold water, they took it off the mountain and built miles and miles of aqueducts that led the cold water to come down into the king's palace so the queen could have a cold bath if she wanted to when it was hot. And then they had this other one that they heated the water that made hot water. Wow. First time they had indoor cold water. Wow. And this king did that. He was a great builder. Now, the problem with him was not just that he done some great things of restoring Jerusalem and rebuilding them, but the problem was he was a control freak. He was a paranoid control freak. He used people. He used the Jewish people. He used the Roman political system of their time, and he even abused his power to maintain control of what he had built or what he was about to build. You understand what I'm saying? He would run over you if he needed to. He would kill you if he needed to get what he wanted, to stay in control of what he had or to be in control of what he's about to do. Now, you've seen people like that, haven't you? There's some people that work for people like that. They run over anybody that gets in their way because they're trying to control their kingdom. Some of us are like that too, in a way, aren't we? Because we don't like change. So this guy, and let me tell you, he suffered. Psychologists done research on some of the things that he had done over his life, and they said he had paranoia delusions. That means that he was worried about people killing him and taking over. He was worried about anybody. And if he thought you looked at him wrong, he'd kill you, just like that. And he didn't care who you were. You don't get in this guy's way. King Herod the Great is bad, mean, controlling. He's not Jewish, and he's using everything to get what he wants. Herod executed his brother-in-law for conspiracy. When Herod suspected 2 of his several sons. He had several sons. He suspected 2 of them for plotting against him at one time. He charged them with treason and had his own sons strangled because they were getting in his way and he thought they were going to take what he had. Herod's firstborn son was named Antipas. His firstborn son. On Herod, Herod had this bad disease. At the end of his life, he had this terrible disease that some say are kidney problems or whatever. They can't really tell, but they said it was very painful. There's this Flavius Josephus, who was writing at that time for the Roman Empire, recorded historically that he had I'm just reading it, said a painful, debilitating disease that caused breathing problems, convulsions, and the rotting of his body, and he even had worms. This guy had a bad disease. In the last couple of days, 5 days before he died, now he doesn't know he's about to die, but 5 days before he ended up dying, 5 days before that, his favorite son, his oldest son, the one to take over for him, was charged with plotting against his father, and he executed him 5 days before he was born. Before he died. He's bad. Do you understand this? I was listening to Andy Stanley, and Andy Stanley had preached on this several weeks ago, and I was listening to some of his stuff, and he's just saying, this guy, you just didn't want to get in his way. Because he didn't care about you. He didn't care about anything. All he cared about was control. And he is the king when Jesus is born. He's the king that Joseph, let me tell you, when Caesar Augustus said, I want everybody to be counted, how's the best way to do that? We probably need to take them back to their hometowns and let them be counted. Then do it. King Herod comes back and says what? We're going to count the people. You think Mary and Joseph are going, I'm 9 months pregnant, I'm 8 months pregnant, I'm not traveling that 200 miles on a donkey to get there. You better. Do you understand? You better. That's why they got up and left. People were afraid of this guy. And this is a king who was a king when Jesus was born. Now he ended up being over that kingdom for 37 years. Now at the end of his life, after he died, the Romans had to do something to make another king, right? So they divided the kingdom from under him. What Andy Stanley said was, before, now I'm just going off what Andy said. I hadn't researched this, so I just heard it on his message. Andy said that before his death, Herod got all the rich and wealthy people, one from every family, the leaders of the people, and put them in jail. Took all the wealthy, all the prominent people in the town and put them in jail. And then he told his employees, told his servants, the day I die, kill them all. Because somebody's going to mourn for me when I die. He was so hated, he knew nobody would shed a tear when he died. So he's told his servants, you kill every one of these leaders because somebody's going to cry for me when I die. Now, the reason we know this is his servants, when he died, didn't kill him. They released those prisoners, and they were actually celebrating in the street. Now, the Roman Empire gets wind of this, and they're like, well, who are we going to give this kingdom to? So they divided up between his 3 remaining sons. One of those, you know what his name was? Yes. No, he had lined that up before that. He put him in prison like months before that. But he said, kill him when I die. He didn't know when he was going to die. So as soon as he died, that's when they were supposed to kill him. Then everybody would have been sad and crying for their loved ones, not really crying for him. But he would have felt like that people would have been crying for him. You see what I'm saying? Now, listen to this. One of his 3 sons, his name was Herod Antipas. Say that. Herod Antipas. This is the guy that was a king over the time that Jesus was crucified. So Herod the Great, who's the evil king, was the one that was when King Herod, when Jesus was born. Herod Antipas is one of his sons who had seen both his brothers killed, a third brother killed, is the king who's over everything when Jesus comes for trial before Pilate. And they send him to King Herod. And that king says, do a trick for me. Do a miracle. This is Herod's son, the one we're talking about. You got me? So it's not, they ain't the same people, but they can. Okay? So let me read this to you. I'm going to catch you this story. This is in Matthew. It says, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea, during the time of King Herod, we know who we're talking about, Magi, or wise men, from the east came to Jerusalem and asked, where is this one who has been born King of the Jews? We saw his star when it arose, and we have come to worship him. When King Herod heard this, he was what? Disturbed. Say that again. He was what? Disturbed. And all of Jerusalem with him. You know why? He just found out somebody that he's been killing everybody to keep control. There's a baby that's all born King of the Jews. Where is he at? I'm getting rid of this guy. All of Jerusalem is disturbed. Why? This guy's nuts. He'll kill us all. They're worried that this whole caravan of wise men from another country is coming to worship a king, and it's not King Herod the Great. This guy's going to go ballistic. I'd be scared out of my boots. Now, this is where we are. And all of Jerusalem was disturbed with him. When he had called together all the people's chief priests, all the teachers of law, he asked them where the Messiah was to be born. They said, in Bethlehem of Judea, they replied, for this is what was written by the prophet. So they know what the scriptures say, but they ain't one of them going to pop off like, you've been the king of the Jews. You ought to know where he's going to be born. They ain't saying that. I'm thinking those rabbis and those chief priests coming in there, they scared to answer anything. Bethlehem is 5 miles from from Jerusalem. It's in the same county, Judea, 5 miles. 5 miles, half the distance between here and Brooklyn. Miles. From one side of town to the other side of town in Statesboro is about 5 miles. 5 miles, that's all it is. His palace is here. This new king of the Jews is here, 5 miles away. But the problem was, Herod couldn't control that situation. See, he couldn't control who God was making king to replace him. He tried to kill everybody that got in his way, but he couldn't control what God was doing. So he resisted. And he tried to control the outcome. And let me tell you something. Sometimes in our life, we try to control the outcomes in our life. We try to set things up. We all have a little bit of Herod in us at times. We all have a little bit of Herod in us. We want to control the outcome so badly that we might use others. We might lie. We might steal. We might misuse our resources. We might misuse our talents. We might even use God. You want to be my using God? We're only going to pray to you when we need you. And I'm only going to pray to you to get what I want. I'm going to manipulate you. I'm going to tell you what you need to hear, God, and I'm still going to do what I want to do because I want to control you. And there's a lot of us in this room, including myself, I'm guilty of that. I try to stack the deck in my favor. You can use any of those analogies you want to, but the truth is we have a control issue. We all have a little bit of Herod in us. We want to manipulate God and use him. Listen to what Herod tried to do. Verse 7. Then Herod called the Magi secretly, and he found out from them the exact time the star had appeared. He sent them to Bethlehem and said, go and search carefully for the child. As soon as you find him, report to me so that I may too go and worship him. He won't even go check it out himself. He's manipulating those wise men from another country that really don't know a lot about him. He's manipulating to come back and tell him. He's using control to stay in control rather than yielding his will and following the guiding star. See, everybody's seen that star. Those wise men are following the star, but that star's up there. Everybody can see it. Nobody's paying any attention. That's what happens to us sometimes at Christmas. Everybody sees the stuff that's all the lights on your trees. Everybody sees all the things that point us toward Jesus, but some of us just aren't paying attention. Some of us are trying to control our parties and our activities and what's in the presents and all that. We're so caught up in all this, we can't see that light of the star. He won't even listen to the guidance of his religious leaders who say, he's right over there in Bethlehem, 5 miles away. We can be over there in 30 minutes. Walking, I guess, I'd get on a horse, but not Herod. He ain't even going to go 5 miles. He's not going to follow the signs of the wise men who miles away have traveled for nearly 2 years. Nearly 2 years these guys traveled to come and see this king. He won't even yield when he's confronted by the truth. See, we all got a little bit of Herod in us. We all want to be right. We meet this truth of Jesus Christ, or meet this truth that people give us, meet the truth that the church is talking about, meet the truth that talks about this light. And we want to stay in control. Be the man. Be the woman. Not going to yield. Verse 9. After they had heard the king, they went on their way, and the star that they had seen when it rose went ahead of them until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they were overjoyed. On coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother, Mary, and they bowed down and they worshiped him. They opened their treasures and presented him with gifts of gold and frankincense and myrrh. They didn't come with nothing. They came to worship. Listen, worship is more about us standing around here singing, people. Worship is about standing in front of something in awe, with your mouth dropped open, that something is greater than you are. And they brought this something, this baby, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. These are kings. We 3 kings of Orient. They're kings. They bowed down. They yielded. They bent their knee. I get this image of the Spartan 300 in my mind when I say that. If everybody watched the 300 or the Spartan, you know what I'm talking about, the 300? And what's that guy's name? Leonidas. I'm not going to bow down. These guys, oh yeah, we'll bow down to a baby because we know what you represent. See, they were submissive. See, we don't want to be submissive in this world today. We don't want to yield to anything, not even to a God we can't even see. But they yield to be able to meet Jesus and come up close and personal. Not from a distance, not from a palace wall. They didn't stay over there and say, we'll send emissaries on our behalf. They go, I'm going to go see myself. And all they did was follow the light. Now when they had gone, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream, and he said, get up. He said, you take this child and his mother, and you escape to Egypt, and you stay there until I tell you, for Herod is going to search for the child to kill him. So he got up and he took the child and his mother during the night and he left for Egypt, where he stayed until the death of Herod. And so was fulfilled what the Lord had said through the prophet, out of Egypt I will call my son. See, people always wonder, well, how is Jesus going to come from Egypt? Well, that's how he got to Egypt, because of this crazy King Herod. When Herod realized, the wise men, they went by a different way. They went back home a different way. They were told in a dream to go a different way. So Herod's sitting there going, where are they at? I mean, how many dead-burned days does it take to find this baby? I mean, he is losing his mind. He's killed his own family. Don't think this guy's a level-headed guy. Now, he's tricky. He'll abuse power. So listen to what he says. He says, when Herod realized that he had been outwitted by the Magi, imagine the veins busting out in his neck and coming up on his head and him turning red. Can you imagine what his face looks like? He was furious, and he gave orders to kill the boys in Bethlehem and its vicinity, who were 2 years old and under, in accordance with the time he had learned from the Magi. See, he was a villain in this story. Herod did everything he could to have a legacy that people would know him, to be known. And basically, he's a footnote in this story. And I'm telling you, we all got a little bit of Herod in us. See, the problem was, the dilemma that the king had was to resist or to worship. And that's what we have. When you're encountering the truth, when you're encountering the truth about Jesus Christ, you might not have met him, you might not have seen him, but when you encounter the truth after the truth, at some point in time, you got to make a decision. Am I going to keep resisting this, or am I going to yield in worship? Yesterday, my kids took me to go see Star Wars. them all before this. Then they had to remind me that I forgot what the Millennium Falcon was and a TIE fighter. Chris was sitting beside me. I was like, that's a Millennium Falcon. He said, no, that's a TIE fighter. I'm like, okay, you're right. In this story of Star Wars, in every one, there's this conversation about the Force, the light, and the dark side. And I think within that story we can hear some of this. We all have the light in us, but there's a dark side that calls us to stay in control and not yield to the light. To stay in control, to use our anger, to use our frustration, to control things, to manipulate things, to use people to get what we want. See, there are all kinds of things that can cause you to drift away from God. And I don't know where you are today, and I don't know where you are, but my question to you is today, what would it take for you to take one step back toward Christ? One step toward that King. One step toward that baby Jesus. What would it take? Maybe it's no more than you just, well, maybe I'll pray. I haven't prayed in a while. Maybe I'll pray. Maybe it's no more, maybe I'll sing that song. Maybe I'll go to church more often this year. Maybe I'll listen more at church. Maybe I'll try to help volunteer and do something. Maybe I'll step outside of maybe it's not all about me. Maybe it's about what God can do through me. Maybe He's given me not gold and frankincense and myrrh, but maybe He's given me a brain, and He's given me a heart, and He's given me a love, and He's given me passion, and I'm willing to share that with the King. Maybe I'll get out of my palace. I'll take a few steps and head down that road, and it's only 5 miles away. John was one of Jesus' disciples. John chronologically wrote the last 5 books of the Bible, chronologically. He's the last disciple to die. He was so close to Jesus, one of his disciples. Jesus on the cross looked down at him and told him, he said, John, take care of my mama. He said, Mama, this is now your son. Y'all going to need each other. Now, he didn't say those words, but he implied that when he said, this is your mom and this is your son. John, who had seen the various miracles that Jesus had performed. John, who went to the tomb and rushed to the tomb and goes in and sees the empty tomb. John, who had seen the resurrected Jesus eating fish and talking to people and teaching more. John, who knew John, who was persecuted, who was on an island by himself, remembering all of this stuff that he had learned and remembering the Old Testament that he'd been taught as a little boy. The New Testament isn't written. He hadn't read all the things they other, but he knows. He knows that this light, this star, this baby Jesus, listen to what he says. He said, in him was life. And that life was the light of all mankind. And that light shines in the darkness. And the darkness has not overcome it. See that light that's in you? Darkness can't overcome it. Darkness will never overcome the light that leads you to Christ. You can ignore it. You can try to control it. But darkness will never overtake light. So I don't care where you've been or what you've done. I don't care if you're good or bad. I don't care if you've been naughty or nice. I'm not checking a list and checking it twice. What I'm saying to you is, that light, the part that you hear in this message that's resonating with you is the light that will lead you to a new life. And all it takes is you getting up and looking at everything you've got and everything that you fought so hard to keep, everything that you've tried to control and all the people you used, all the people you abused, and you look at your whole life history and just go,